everyone. Welcome to the Gold Goats and Guns podcast for December 2nd, 2025. My name is Tom Luongo. We have a lot to talk about. It's episode 239, and I have the great pleasure of having Brent Johnson back on the podcast of Santiago Capital. Brent, how are you?
I'm good. Just got back from Thanksgiving, which was fantastic. And so back at work.
Yeah, that's kind of the way I took, I don't know, about 12 hours off or 14 hours off, and then went right back to it. Like, my wife complains at me all the time. It's like, stop looking at your phone. I'm like, I can't help it. It's
the first trip I have gone in I don't know how many years where I did not take my laptop with me and did not like log in during the day. So it was 4 days, but it was fantastic.
Good. You have to recharge every once in a while, and I'm looking forward to, actually, to be honest with you, I hate to admit this in public, but tomorrow Guild Wars Reforged drops, and I think we're all just going to like take 2 days off and play that for a couple of days, which would be a lot of fun.
There you go.
So I've got a small group that I play with on a semi-regular basis. So let's not talk about that stuff anymore. Let's actually get to it. So you have been picking up a thread that first started with myself and Caitlin Long, that I saw with me and Vince and Caitlin Long, and all this stuff about stable coins. And you've been talking about it nonstop. I think you did you present something over at New Orleans about this as well? Or
my entire presentation in New Orleans was on this topic, and that was based on a 30 or 40 page research report we had put out on it shortly before that. So we've done quite a bit of work on it over the last couple of months.
Excellent. So why don't we start there and what you're seeing, and
Sure.
And we'll start comparing notes as to where we are. Because as I said to you before we hit record, which is that, I talk about all these things in a kind of scattershot or almost stream of consciousness approach. And it's nice to have somebody actually like settle it down, make a proper presentation out of it in order for people to kind of digest it in all one big felled swoop. So if you go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I'll say is, even though I've just kind of started talking about these things, this is not new. These have been around for 10, 12, 13 years now. Mm-hmm. And I have gone down the rabbit hole on them a couple different times, usually around the same time I had gone down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, mainly because of Tether. Tether is a central part of Bitcoin in my opinion, and Tether is by far the largest US dollar stablecoin. And it was because of the things I ran into in researching Tether that I kind of pushed these to the side and didn't give them much credence. And I was of the belief that if and when they ever came into conflict with the United States government, there would be a battle. And while I didn't know who would win that battle, I was certain that the United States could at least do some damage along the way, right? And so I never really embraced the whole stablecoin concept. But what really kind of changed it for me was the Genius Act. And when it was started to be talked about it, I started to look into these things again. And then when the Genius Act was passed, and some of the comments that were made around it, and when you read through the bill, what you really start to realize, at least in my opinion, is that the United States as an official entity has co-opted the innovation from the private market that the private market developed, and it seems to me are using it to build a parallel Eurodollar system, or the early stages of a parallel Eurodollar system. Now mm-hmm. I've made a lot of big jumps in those few sentences, and we can dig into that. But that's what really caught my attention. And then also they started to get more, publicity because of the belief that this is a way to save the dollar, because there was going to be nobody else that would buy the debt. And so now the U.S. wants these stable coins because that will be the buyers of last resort, that nobody else would have showed up. And I actually think that's wrong.
I agree.
But I think in many ways, I don't know if anybody is a hunter or not, but to me, that's a decoy. That's something to get people focused on, mm-hmm. to remove eyes on what the real plan. And the real plan, in my opinion, is to get more control over the global monetary system than they already have. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, they can then use the dollar as a weapon even more than they do now. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean that they will have full control and perfect control, but I think it is a system and a method via which they can get more control than they currently have. The U.S. has more control than anybody, but nobody really controls the Eurodollar system.
Right.
And I don't think the U.S. likes that they don't control the euro dollar system.
I know they don't like they
Yeah,
don't like that,
right.
or we would still be on LIBOR,
No,
right?
exactly. That's and that's one of the things we talked about in our papers. I used the LIBOR to SOFR transfer as an example of the U.S. wanting to get control and the steps that they took to do so.
Hmm.
And it didn't happen right away. I think that transfer of LIBOR to SOFR was a 5, 6, 7 year process from beginning to end.
It's like
And
about 5 years.
yeah,
Started
and
in
so
early
you
2018 or
know, I don't think this is all going to happen tomorrow.
so.
And in many ways, I could see the U.S. just let people let the private market run wild with it for 3, 4, 5 more years in order to get adoption, and then kind of put their clamps on it. But it's a fascinating topic for me because it kind of sits at the heart of capital flows and monetary system and the private market versus public market. And country versus country, geopolitics gets involved here, and
Mhm.
it's just a really, really fascinating topic. And I think those who are dismissing it are doing so to their own detriment.
It's not just that I've actually run into the exact opposite of that one. I mean, I guess there are people out there that are dismissing it as just another way of extending dollar hegemony, which is a phrase I can't stand. It's really dumb. Oh, by the way, if the dollar wasn't the best currency in the world, people wouldn't use it.
Right.
I mean, this is the oh, by the way, and people breathe, right?
Yeah.
It's one of those obvious facts that it gets ignored while people try to shape a narrative around a particular thing. So the what you bring up is that the dollar is, I actually had a chat with somebody yesterday about this. I was on a different channel and they were going over, well, this is the building of the panopticon and this is the new neo-colonialism and blah blah blah, blah. I'm like, no, no, it's actually ringing. In my mind, looking at 100% treasury backed, regulated stable coins are actually removing leverage from the system because we're now actually in control of that euro dollar system and the gearing inside the euro
Yeah.
dollar system, because we control we say how much leverage there can be. There's going to be leverage used within the domestic markets because American banks can issue their own stable coins against the loans that they make. And then they can have their own, and individual banks can have their own leverage ratios. But the offshore banks are not going to be able to do that to the same.
I don't think so. I don't know for sure, but I tend to agree with you that they won't be able to. The question, well, they can do it, but what will the consequences be? And will they still have the same access to U.S. capital if they do it against the wishes of the United States, right? And so
Well,
again, it
yeah.
just brings more control back to the U.S.
Well, again, and that's what this is the thing is like what Vince Lanci and I have been talking about is how we're going to set up controls around the offshore dollar, the euro dollar, and the onshore dollar. And the onshore dollar is going to trade at a premium in terms of purchasing power versus the offshore dollar, which will trade. If you want access to dollars, you're going to have to buy them for $1.05. If you want to trade them for 90 cents, you go right ahead and do so. So if you want to lever them up and trade them at 95 or 98 cents, that's great. But understand that we control the
Yep.
access to them, and therefore we can go, you know what? No, and then we can bankrupt you. And as opposed to the years of the LIBOR and Eurodollar dominated markets, which started in the mid 50s, moved all the way until very recently, the US was never in charge of its own monetary policy. And that was the point
Yep.
of the whole LIBOR offshore shadow banking system. So, um, you can, I just want to take out the whole what's the word I'm looking for? The negative connotation of the United States getting control over its own markets. This is what they should do. This is what a sovereign nation should do. And
Right.
if you don't like the stable coin, the US dollar stable coin system that we're putting in place, and you don't want to use our stable coins, well, then maybe you as sovereign governments should get your act together and issue currencies that don't suck. And then you
Yeah.
can issue your own stable coins in Turkish lira or Nigerian naira or whatever, or and do it that way. Or you can live with the fact that the United States is going to eat your lunch.
Well, to me,
Yeah.
that is the key to this all, is that
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a way for the U.S. to, I mean, I could try to be nice about this, but I'll just say to invade a foreign country without using the military to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the local population adopts US dollar stablecoins as their preferred medium of exchange because the local currency, as you say, sucks, and I agree with you, you know, it doesn't take long before that local currency starts to fail.
Mm-hmm.
And once a currency starts to fail, a government typically fails pretty closely thereafter. And the reason those two are related is money is a form of control, and governments use money as a form of control. So if they lose control of money in their local jurisdiction, they lose control politically in that jurisdiction. And it's in my mind, this is a way for the US to sort of quote unquote steal sovereignty from a foreign country without, you know, parking an aircraft carrier off their coast. And the other thing about it is it's done voluntarily by their citizens as opposed to mandate from Washington or New York or wherever it is.
Right.
And that then gives the United States plausible deniability. We didn't do it. Your own citizens did it. Right. Now, is it to our advantage? Sure, it's to our advantage. And, you know, but it's your jurisdiction. If you want to stop them, try to stop them. Right.
Well,
but then that has trying to stop it has consequences as well.
agreed. And the other, but see, and this is the interesting part about all this is that that's kind of the first order. That's one path of this, right? That's one path is, oh, the evil mustache twirling United States and their banking system are going to go out like the evil capitalist oligarchs that they are and do the robber barons that they are and do the thing. Well, maybe it's always possible. It all depends on what kind of relationships the United States actually puts together in terms of trade and foreign policy with these countries. Sure. We have always lived under we're all right, of an age. We're in our 50s. We've lived under the age of American imperialism, which is really just a cover for freaking British and old, European colonialism through the Eurodollar system. If you look at the way Trump has been dealing with trade policy, and this is the part that I find interesting, is he's not cutting trade deals where we get the factories, we get their raw materials and the factories, and they get dollars in return. He's actually putting together plans where, no, we're going to build stuff and do JVs locally. If you look at the 28-point peace plan, the 0.1 beta peace plan for Russia, Ukraine, what's in there? The money, everything about money in that peace plan was the U.S. and Russia will enter into joint partnerships to develop various assets, meaning both countries will share in the benefit of this. Right. That's not a colonial process. A colonial process is always use the currency as a means by which to extract wealth at pennies on the dollar and send them home to fill your factories, and then you get to sell the finished goods around the world. And that's what we have to watch for, right? If we start seeing that old model, well, then yeah, obviously all those criticisms of the Genius Act and the stablecoins will bear fruit. But if we don't see that, if we see partnerships with these trade deals, that's a different system.
Well, my guess is you'll see both. With some countries, you'll see it go one way, and with other countries, you'll see it go the other way, right? That's true. As has always been the case. And and this is what I always try to tell people. And I'll say it again here in case anybody who's heard me talk before is going to say, Brent, we've heard you say this 100 times. Sure. But for the event that some of your audience has never heard me talk about it before, is you kind of have to set aside what you would like to see happen. You have to set aside what you think others would like to see happen, and actually figure out what it is that others would like to see happen or what they would do. Right. And the simple fact is that people around the world, in many, many countries around the world, prefer the US dollar to their local currency. Now, you may believe that they should prefer to use gold or silver or Bitcoin or whatever it is. And you may believe that the dollar is a horrible currency, but they do not. And that is borne out by the market. The market tells me that. And if you look at the stable coins that exist so far, 99% of the stable coins are US dollar stable coins. Now, gold stable coins exist, euro stable coins exist, other stable coins exist, but 99% are tied to the US dollar. And the reason they're tied to the US dollar is that is the issuers trying to meet market demand. That
Mhm.
is not the issuers going out there and saying, "Oh, you want a euro stablecoin? Well, too bad. We're giving you a dollar one." No, no, no. It's the market demanding dollar stablecoins and the issuers trying to meet that demand. So
Right.
that is the market saying on a global basis, we prefer dollars. We don't prefer euros or yen or yuan or ruble or whatever it is.
Right.
And so, I think this is the new digital expression of what the euro dollar market decided decades ago.
To reiterate the point you made to start out with, the United States then gets to control what the price people pay for dollars is, and it should be that way. Now, if they decide to charge too much, well, hey, then someone else will
Right.
decide to come in with something else. I find really interesting about all of this is that your point about it's like this: we analyze the world we've got, not the world we want. That's why I've been saying this since I first
Yep.
sort of periscoping in 2016. It's a very simple idea and a very simple heuristic and frame to see the world through. And so what we're dealing with at this point in time is we have a lot of people with an axe to grind
Yeah.
that are commenting in the
Yeah.
space.
Yeah.
I mean, and I don't
Yeah.
care if it's the former version of myself who hated it. You and I talked about this the last time we were on the show.
Yeah.
We've both gone through a similar
Yeah.
like the psychological process with how with our relationship to our home country, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I just find so for anybody who's listening that you should go listen to the last time that Brent was on the show. We chatted about that at length, as a matter of fact. And so for me, it's very obvious that the market wants this. I can also say I think, and this is one of the things that Vince and I talked about in the last episode of the podcast, that there's also something else going on here where this entire system has to be recollateralized. It can't just be U.S. Treasuries, us issuing more debt, us, and all of that stuff. It has to be. There's going to have to be a hard collateral um, at at the bottom of all of this, because if we don't do it, the United States, then someone else could, and then make their stable coins better. So, and what I'm getting at, obviously, is that at some point, that's why all the central banks are rushing for gold, and
Right.
the treasuries are all rushing for gold.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think many people, when they see the central banks have been buying gold and when they see what the price of gold has done, they automatically assume that means the death of the US dollar and the US control of the monetary system. And it doesn't necessarily mean that. Now, clearly, when gold does what it has done,
Mm-hmm.
that is a sign that the market, the people of the world are saying, hey, something is not quite right. But people in China are not buying gold because they fear the dollar losing purchasing power. They're buying gold because the yuan is a horrible currency and they know that it's going to lose more value.
Right.
And the same thing you go through other countries. And U.S. people are buying gold because we are losing purchasing power here as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the point of my whole milkshake theory has always been you can have gold going up dramatically. And as long as the dollar is not falling versus its foreign peers, it's not going anywhere.
Right.
Right.
And that's borne itself out. The dollar's been trading, and I mean, even in a year where the Treasury Department and the president have purposefully devalued the dollar in order to force trade deals onto their opponent, to their trade partners, even then the U.S. dollar index has not really moved.
Yeah, it hasn't really gone anywhere since April, right? I mean, it fell
Exactly.
kind of into April. Now it's just kind of gone sideways. You touched on something earlier that I think is important because one of the problems for the U.S. with the euro dollar market is the fact that the rest of the world has issued dollars in a currency that they cannot control and that they are not ultimately responsible for. And as a result, that does hurt the rest of the world when a credit crunch comes, but it also does eventually come back to the United States. And I've always made the argument it starts in the periphery, but it does eventually reach the core. So I don't
Right.
think the US gets hurt first, but it does eventually come back and hit the US.
Yep.
And part of the reason that is the case is because right now, a dollar and a euro dollar, or a US domestic dollar and an offshore dollar, trade at par. They are convertible. They are fungible. There is no difference other than geography between a dollar sitting in Dallas and a dollar sitting in Dubai. They trade one for one. But and as a result, that's why it can pyramid back down onto the U.S. because the foreigners can claim they can make a claim to the base money that only exists in the U.S.
Right.
as you go down the daisy chain at par. And so I think, as you have alluded to, that this new system is a way to potentially change that, right? To make it to where it is no longer at par.
Yep.
And if it doesn't trade at par, it is no longer, it doesn't mean that it still can't come back and cause problems for the US, but not to the same extent that it currently does.
Yep.
Especially if that, let's say we eventually get to an onshore dollar and an offshore dollar, and under your example, one trades at $1 and the other one trades at $1.05 or whatever it is, right? Even at $1.05, it's not that big a deal. But in some kind of a crisis where now the euro dollar is trading at 130 instead of 105 and it's losing value versus the dollar, that becomes a much bigger deal. And the consequences of it start to hurt the rest of the world more than it hurts the United States. And it gives the U.S. more control over who they help and who they don't. And the U.S. already kind of does this through the swap lines, right?
Yes.
And people will tell me, well, the reason that the U.S. gives swap lines is because if they didn't, then the foreigners would sell the U.S. dollar assets, and that would be bad for the U.S. And yes, that is true. But again, the problem is starting on the periphery. It doesn't. When someone in Brazil sells their U.S. dollar assets, they're selling them because they are in dire straits and need the liquidity.
Yep.
So you can't say that the U.S. giving a swap line to Brazil starts in the U.S. and then goes to Brazil. No, it's starting in Brazil on the perimeter, and then it's coming into the core. And this new system and I haven't quite figured out exactly how they'll do it. And I don't know if I'm smart enough to figure that out exactly, but I do agree with you that is one of the issues that they would like to solve.
I think it's very much I think that's, I don't have a clear answer to that, what they're going to do thing either. I've been talking about it kind of in the bubble framework, like you put the flow chart up on the board with using Microsoft PowerPoint or project or whatever you got. Well, we need to create a Federal Reserve that enforces the international, the domestic par versus international par. How they do that, I don't know. Is it how they price swap lines? Is it how they set up various facilities? Do American banks get preferential treatment to the quote unquote the Fed discount window, or even better, noting also that the whole stablecoin infrastructure ecosystem is an end run around the Federal Reserve, because now it's direct treasury money, and that's now a digital form of greenback more than it is a Federal Reserve note, right? Because these stable coins aren't being issued by the Federal Reserve. So is the Fed then just the firewall, meaning foreign actors have to go to the Fed to get dollars, because we're not running the same kind of budget deficits that we have in the past. If we fix the fiscal side, this has been my argument for a long time. You fix the fiscal side of the situation. Now you're not issuing as many treasury bonds on a regular basis. Yeah, you're issuing bills to fund the growth of the stablecoin market, but that's a different thing. Those are going to be created and destroyed. They don't affect the long-term credit rating of the U.S. in that respect. But if you do that, and then you have the Fed is the one where everybody has to go to get dollars offshore when they need them, then to service their dollar denominated liabilities, well, then we have a different scenario. And that's how you can kind of separate the Fed's role from the Treasury's role. And that's how you, in the long run, get to an onshore dollar and an offshore dollar. That's the way Vince and I have been thinking about this for a while now. And I know that I haven't talked to Caitlin Long in a couple of months, actually a few months now, to get her latest thoughts on this as well. So just throwing it out there.
Well, what you're touching on though, and listen, I don't have the answer either, but and I have not written about this yet, but we're planning to write about this. So stay tuned. there is, in addition to the US, let's just say going to war with the rest of the world over the monetary system, they may be going to war internally. And what I mean by that is the rise of stable coins, it makes it easier. It doesn't necessarily rule out the necessity for the Fed, but it makes it easier for the Treasury to take over monetary policy.
Yes.
And I've said for a long time that we are headed for a battle between the Treasury and the Fed, and that I think the Treasury will ultimately win. Now, whether the Fed ends up getting absorbed by the Treasury, or whether they just take orders from the Treasury, or whether they get somebody into the Fed that works hand in glove, because it's their lackey or whatever it is. But once you have a US dollar stable coin that is done by the Treasury and can be done digitally, and each individual can open a wallet and receive and make payments back, and receive payments from the government, make payments back to the government. Because you got to remember, the Fed is the Treasury's bank.
Right.
If you no longer need the bank to transact between the individuals and the Treasury, you no longer need their distribution arm, right?
Right.
And so but this is going to be a huge battle. Like the banking system is one of the biggest lobbies that there is, right? It's one of the biggest allocators of capital there is. They are not going to go quietly into that good night, right? They're going to fight to keep control of monetary policy. The Fed is not going to want to give that up. But, that doesn't mean that they're going to win just because they don't want to lose.
Right.
And so, but all these different little battlegrounds are opening up now. And this is, this is it's just another hallmark of the fourth turning, right? Where these institutions that once seemed mighty and impossible to fall end up going by the wayside because things change. And I think we've talked about this, and I'm pretty sure you agree, but feel free to push back if you don't.
Sure.
Is that I think for a couple of years now we have been, and we're moving into more of an environment that requires people to think not just from an economics perspective when evaluating economic projects, but thinking from a politics and a power perspective. Because, I've been doing this for 25 years now. And for basically all of that time, if I was evaluating an investment opportunity, I could, look at the economic aspects of it and pencil it out on a spreadsheet. And if it made sense, you do it. But, you can no longer just say something is going to work or fail based on the spreadsheet, because power and politics will trump that. And I think the pendulum is now swinging back that direction. And I think it's going to be very hard to stop that pendulum from going further in that direction. So, and I think this could last 10, 15, 20 years where this is the case.
I think I know where you're going with this, which is that, our government has made some very controversial choices from a free market perspective to take strategic positions in companies like Intel and others. And there's the Office of Strategic Capital, I think is the name of the thing that that's the thing that no one's talking about, that you brought up before we started recording today. And we want to move back, and you want to move the conversation into that realm. And I think that this is a very, very important thing to consider. Like we've outlined here with the Eurodollar system under LIBOR, we were not in control of our own monetary policy. You cannot be a country worth its salt if you don't control your own monetary policy. Or at least you can't be the core. You can't be like the United States, right? The core economy of the world, without being in control of your own monetary policy. Same thing with your military, same thing with your domestic policy, same thing with your industrial policy. So I find normally I would like look at this and be anathema that we would take, a government position in a company like Intel or any of these other firms. But I remember what Putin had to do back in Russia in 2000 in order to stop the globalists from destroying and taking over all of these state assets that were really publicly, these were public goods. Companies like Yukos and Gazprom and not Rosneft and one, these are public goods. These are the birthright of the Russian people, and they were being stolen by the City of London and Wall Street assets left and right. Guys like Bill Browder and Edmund Safra and all. I mean, all of that stuff. And
that's a big story that you and I need to talk about sometime. There's
oh,
two sides of that
I know
story that are equally
I've gone.
fascinating. Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
I've
yeah, I
gone
know you
into
do.
that story and I've gone
Yeah,
out of that
yeah,
story. I've had that story
yeah,
in my back pocket for 10 years now.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. It's really fascinating.
So that's the way I see this. I don't know that, so this is something I think we need to discuss it, that in a sense that this, what we're talking about, all the things that Brent and I are talking about now are really the hallmark of a transitions period. We almost have to do this from a national security perspective first
Yeah.
before we can, go back to any kind of
Well, and here's the
market.
part that we've talked about this before, and here's the part that I struggle with because I am a free market guy. I'm a capitalist. I don't like the marriage of government and state, right? I don't like the government meddling into the free market dynamics. But the truth is, we've never truly had a free market. We have perhaps had a more of a free market than other places, but we've never had a truly free market. And even if I don't like the government taking a more active role, as someone who manages other people's capital, doesn't matter what I like. I just have to analyze the world as it is and figure out what the hell they're going to do. And just because I don't like it doesn't mean they're going to stop, right?
Right.
And so I have to take that into account when I am making a decision and when I'm analyzing things. And so I think the people that do a free market analysis on a project and come to a conclusion, and then when the government interferes and they say that, well, that's manipulation. Well, to me, they've only done half the analysis. Yeah, I agree. It's only happening because of the government. But listen, the government's a real thing. As much as you and I might not like it, they're a real player and they're in the market, and you have to take their actions into account. And so while I don't necessarily like from a free market perspective what is happening, if I look at this as the big game, which I have often described what's going on in the world, the big geopolitical tensions as the big game, right? It's the global hegemon trying to stay on top, and it's the up and comers trying to usurp their position. And the U.S. is going to do everything it can to stay on top of the mountain, and then the usurpers are going to do everything they can to knock us off. And so, from that perspective, there are some things we have to do in order to stay there. And if I'm trying to win that game, then it completely makes sense what the government is now doing, especially when you realize, which COVID put on perfect display, the dependence on some critical inputs that the United States needs coming from adversarial countries, right? And so at a minimum, we need to be either self-sufficient or move more towards self-sufficiency. And if and when it ever becomes kinetic between us and our adversaries, then it becomes an even bigger deal. And I think it was Hemingway. There's a great quote, and I'm pretty sure it's by Hemingway. It says something about, once war is declared, the only thing that matters is winning, because nothing is worse than losing a war, or something to that effect.
Right.
And, I've got a son that's 17 years old, and the last thing I want is the war. And so I will do everything I can to keep that from happening. But I also, don't want to be living under communism, quite honestly. I'm a capitalist, right?
Yeah, and
so,
if you frame it from the Chinese, I think you're framing this from the Chinese perspective. I'm actually, I on my side of it, I say this is a great game, but the great game is different. I have the different frame, which is that the real empire never ended, and they're the ones don't want to watch anybody actually get their independence. And those independent actors are America, Russia, and China. That the British and the old Anglo-Dutch, British, Venetian, whatever you want to call it, the Davos, the high table. I don't give a damn. Could pick a metaphor that works for you. And sprinkle with oh my God, all the evil Jews that you want. I don't care. That is the actual game. And everybody else is trying to get out from underneath that system. And what you're actually watching today is not China and the United States at loggerheads, but China and the United States trying to define, and the Russians as well, trying to define where they agree, where they disagree, and how they can work together to get rid of the shitbags in Europe who are literally trying to start World War III amongst everybody, and then come to a détente later on. I've been
Yeah, yeah.
I think there's a Yalta too in the future, that has America, Russia, and China, and we're seeing the beginning of that with how everyone has now said, "Yep, Europe, you get to stay out of the negotiations over Ukraine. We don't want you here." The Russians have said it, the Americans are saying it, the Chinese are saying it, and that's a very, very,
Yeah.
very big tell.
I mean, I don't think Europe could have played this any worse if they had tried. I mean, it's just incredible. It's just incredible.
Mm-hmm.
But something you said, it made me think of something that I think is equally important. And
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people are of the belief that the United States wants to divorce itself from China. And listen, that is true.
Mm-hmm.
But China wants to divorce itself from the United States as well. And if you look at some of the moves they've been doing over the last 10 years, that's pretty clear. It's not like the United States started this, right? This is kind of a mutual divorce. Both sides agree that we are going our separate ways. The question is it going to be amicable or is it going to be confrontational? And
Right.
each side is trying to get all their ducks in a row to where if it does get confrontational, they come out on top. But I don't think anybody wants a war, most of all Trump. And here's the thing, and I may have said this on the last episode, but I'm going to say it again because I think this is important to understand. If you put yourself in Trump's shoes, what does Trump want more than anything in the world? Is he wants his face on the front of the New York Times saying what a great job he is doing, lording over a global economy that's booming. That's number one. And the second thing he wants is his face on Mount Rushmore. Those are his two biggest goals, right? And you can't get your head on Mount Rushmore if China usurps you while you are the president. And you can't get your face on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and New York Times saying what a great business guy you are and what a great deal maker you are if we're in the middle of a global financial crisis, because those two things don't square. So his challenge is, how do you create a booming economy while you keep China in a box? That is really, really hard to do. It's really hard to do. If he just wanted to crush China, probably could have already done it, but that would have had huge blowback on the United States, and we would have been in a recession. That probably would have led to some kind of military conflict in its own right. So it's not as simple as just wanting to beat China. It's wanting China not, because if China collapses, that's going to be a nightmare for the whole world. That will be a nightmare for the whole world.
Of course.
Just like if the United States collapses, it will be a nightmare for the whole world. The idea that the US is going to go into this big recession and the rest of the world is going to be just fine and trade amongst themselves is amongst the dumbest ideas I've ever heard in my life. It's just that's not how it works. But similarly, China's not going to, we're not going to have a collapse in China and the rest of the world goes along its merry way either. That's going to be a disaster as well.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about it from that perspective, you've got these big guys in the sandbox trying to knock the other guy out of the sandbox, or at least control most of the sandbox. And I think I'm bringing this back to my belief that the dollar is going to remain dominant. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that the rest of the world will always continue to use dollars at the same level they currently are. It would not surprise me at all if we go from a globalized world to a very regionalized world. And within those regions, maybe there's a currency that's the dominant currency in that region, other than the dollar. But I do not believe there will be any currency on a global basis that comes anywhere close to the United States dollar. But it doesn't mean that we will become a completely dollarized world either. I do think that the rise of these stable coins will make it more difficult for the rest of the world to de-dollarize. And in fact, I think much of it will become dollarized, especially the small and developing countries. But the bigger countries, the stronger countries, the countries that have more of their own resources, whether it's Russia or China or Japan or some of them that are more developed and perhaps are more authoritarian and can better control their own citizens, will be able to fight against the US dollar stablecoins than other countries will be able to. But I think we're going to a more fractured world, not a more centralized world. So in other words, I think the world on a whole becomes decentralized But within those pockets, I think it becomes more centralized because I think
Sure.
authoritarianism will rise in each of those pockets.
No, that's a fair assessment. It almost has to. We're the world is going tribal. Like
Yeah.
in a big sense,
Yeah.
the world is going tribal.
Yeah.
And the the way I prefer to look at it, there's somebody still trying to like control the sandbox, and I'm telling you,
Yeah.
it's still Europe. It's Europe and City London. Um, the Russians, the Chinese, the Russians to a lesser extent, but the Chinese and the Americans are literally saying, "Look, okay, this is our part of the sandbox. This is your part of the sandbox, and let's leave it let's leave it at that." And this is when you start really thinking about there's a multivariant problem here. Is that this isn't a two-player game. This isn't
Right.
one team versus the other. This is a 5, 6, 7 player game, or at least a two-player game or three-player game being played in 7 or 8 different dimensions. This is the biggest
Yeah.
problem. And of course,
Yeah.
now people will say, "There's Luongo playing 24D chess again," like he always does. Well, unfortunately, folks, it's a 24D fucking world, and that's just the way it works.
Yeah.
Whether you like it, that doesn't matter. Whether you like it or not, whether you think it should be simple or not, it doesn't work that way. So you have Trump fighting multiple wars here. When your point about no one wants a war, well, you're in a war. That war
Yeah.
is financial. That war is cultural. That war is political. That war is geopolitical. It's in the intelligence agencies versus civilian government. We're doing this on December 2nd, and I'm literally sitting here watching our CIA go into open revolt against the civilian government to try and undermine the military because the civilian government and the military are trying to take out their base in Venezuela, their base of operations for the drug trade in Venezuela, which everybody with 5 brain cells that rub together to make a spark knows that that's what's been going on since the 1980s.
Yeah.
And now we're watching CIA assets literally call for insurrection against the government. And
It's pretty crazy, right? It's pretty it's fascinating on so many levels.
Right.
I mean, it's just good. But you just touched on something. And again, it doesn't matter really who is, well, for the point I'm going to make, it doesn't matter who is running the drugs. One thing I would say is for people who think that the United States can no longer do anything and no longer accomplish anything, and they're run by a bunch of idiots who couldn't manage their way out of a paper bag. The US knows where every narco lives. They know where their moms and dads live. They know where their girlfriends live. They know the airports in the jungle, the runways that the planes take off from. They know the marinas that the boats leave from. They have it all mapped out. And anybody who thinks that they don't is being naive. Now, that doesn't mean that the US knows everything. And it doesn't mean that the narcos and the groups running those can't have some success. But the idea that this is just a random thing and the US is just blowing up random boats and they really have no idea who's in them. I mean, you're being crazy.
I used to say during the rise of ISIS back in 2015, Rand Paul, by the way, used to like go into these flights of fantasy. We can't stop ISIS. I'm like, are you kidding me? We can read the license plates from space, and we can't find a bunch of guys running around the desert in Toyota Hiluxes with 30mm cannons on the back of them. 30mm, bullshit. Like you're like, that's nonsense. Of course we can see them. Of course. Now you have to ask yourself why they're being allowed to run around out there, and that's a question no one wants answered.
Right. And that's a totally different question. But the idea that the U.S. is just blind here and doesn't really know what they're doing. I mean, get real.
Shit in one hand, wish in the other. See which one fills up first, right? I got to get it to him.
Well, this is what's funny to me about it is on the one hand, people will tell me that the people in charge are a bunch of idiots that have no idea what they're doing, and on the other hand, they'll say they created a system that enslaved the entire world and nobody even realizes they're doing it. Well, now which is it, right?
Right.
Take your pick because it doesn't go both ways.
Right. Well, and yeah, you will see that on Twitter, like literally in the same tweet.
Yeah.
I mean, you'll see the cognitive dissonance of this in the same tweet. This is what's interesting. It's one of the things that I want to bring up here is that, one of the things that we have to realize is that we live in this is not just an it's obviously it's an informational war. Now we're fighting a fifth generational war that's almost purely informational. And the question you have to ask yourself now is, are you falling for the myth of the omnipotent blah or omnipotent X?
Yeah.
I've been like making this point for a while now. And that's the myth that, these people are all powerful. It doesn't matter who it is, right? In my case, it's the all-powerful city of London. In somebody else's case, it's the all-powerful Jews or the tech bros or the this or that. None of that is true.
No,
it's all the omnipotent anything other than possibly God, depending on your cosmology, is pretty much energetically unsustainable.
Well, not only that, but within those groups, whichever group it is that you think is running things, within that group there are battles. Right?
Yes.
There's two sides to the deep state. There's two sides to the high table. There's two sides to the U.S. government. There's two sides to the Chinese government. Like there are factions within factions within factions.
Yes.
And so when people say this is what the Chinese are thinking, I always just kind of laugh to myself. I was like, well, okay. Right now, yesterday you were an expert on weather, and now you're an expert on what the Chinese are thinking. Good for you. Right.
Well, everybody stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night, right? So
right.
This
Exactly.
is the classic, and this is the classic thing. And what you find is, of course, they seed into the zeitgeist the information that they want you to parrot and to come back to, so that they can newly mint virologists and geopolitical analysts and all the rest of it. And it's like, oh, really? How about no? The world is a lot more complicated than anybody wants to admit. I was doing this, for example, it's like Israel's not a monolith, Iran's not a monolith. So during the 12-day war, I kept like, guys, you have to realize that there's multiple factions within the Israeli government, or they wouldn't be changing governments every 18 months. And then there are factions, within the power structure in Iran that map to different influences, some of which are French, some of which are British, some of which are native Iranian, some of which are, some of which I can't even map. And so once you realize that none of these things are monoliths, then you realize that the world it becomes a question not of, is Iran going to do X? It's more a question of which faction within Iran is dominant, or which faction within Iran just got their asses handed to them. Exactly. And that's the questions you should be asking yourself.
Well, and I want to make this point too, because I think this is also important to understand, is that for anybody who is listening to this and thinking, what does this have to do with finance? 10 or 15 years ago, I may have agreed with you. This is all like secondary stuff that isn't as important. Let's get back to the hardcore numbers. But because of that pendulum that I talked about earlier, this stuff is important. And this stuff is going to increasingly not only impact markets, it is going to make hardcore decisions within those markets of what happens. And as much as I would like to ignore this nonsense, I don't have that luxury. And if you are an investor allocating your capital, I would suggest that you don't have that luxury either. And so you do have to think about these kinds of things.
I agree. It's like I got into this, as an amateur, right? As an amateur gold bug. And so I would get up every morning and I watch the price of gold, and I get up in the morning and they drop bomb at $20 and I get angry, and then my whole day was ruined and blah, 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 blah. And I realized after a while that I was watching the most politicized market in the world. And so certainly 20 years ago, whether it still is or not is a different story, right? But certainly 20 years ago, the gold market was the linchpin to all of the things that we were dealing with. And once you have that realization, you're like, well, now you have to pay attention to politics. What's driving people to do X, Y, and Z? And so slowly, I didn't become this version of me today that exists because I always wanted to be this guy. I became like you. It's a journey. You started here, and I wanted to learn how to do X, and then you go and you keep going until you get to the. And look, I'm a former scientist, and at the end of the day, I'm a former research and process chemist, and like you do root cause analysis, and once you're doing root cause analysis, and you have to actually write CARs, you have to write corrective action reports, you have to do all this stuff. You have to find the variable that is going to be the biggest driver of change. And once you understand that model, you can apply it anywhere. And this is why I am where I am today. A year from now, I may be in a different place.
Overall, my overall framework for looking at the world hasn't really changed in 6 or 7 years.
Hmm.
The framework that I've used has really kind of helped me to understand what's going on. It doesn't mean I've gotten everything right. I'm not sitting here saying that, but for the most part, it's been accurate and it's helped me navigate all the ins and outs. But it doesn't mean that new things don't develop. Like I said, 3 or 4 years ago, right, or really 2 or 3 times over the last 10 years, I took a look at these stable coins and kind of dismissed them. But this last time I looked at them, my mind kind of changed, right?
Right.
Because as things change, you kind of have to take these changes. And I think the world is going to change a lot over
Hmm.
the next 5 or 10 years,
I
right?
agree.
I mean, I think that I don't think that's a crazy statement to make, and I think most people would agree. Um, um, but it doesn't mean that just because every time you see a new headline, you need to change your whole framework. It's good to have a framework. It's good to have a roadmap because then it helps you keep on track and not get distracted by every headline.
Right.
But sometimes when a material change takes place, you have to at least incorporate that into your framework, right? You can't
Hmm.
ignore it just for the sake of staying on your lane or following your map, so to speak.
Or just being on autopilot. And this is and
Yeah.
I will be honest with you. I remember, I've told this story before when I first went to work for Newsmax, writing Gold Stock Advisor, and then we rebranded and whatever. But I was sitting there with a version of the world in my head, and I was analyzing the world that way, and it wasn't working. It was in the middle of the gold bear market. It was 2013,
Yeah.
2014, 2015, and it wasn't
I was
working.
kind of going through the same thing. So
Right. We were all
I,
kind of going through the
yeah,
same
yeah,
thing, right?
yeah.
And then one day, but I was moving into the geopolitics, right? I had already done that. I mean, I already covered the Russian ruble crisis and all of that stuff that was happening. But so I was moving in that right in the right direction. But at some point I went, this is not working. My dollar bear theory, my this theory, all of
Yep.
that stuff's not working. And you eventually just gonna have to look in the mirror and go, well, do you want to be right or do you want to have a
Yeah.
job?
Oh, exactly.
And I went, kind of want to have a job.
Yeah.
Already did the 2 years of grinding unemployment, trying to change careers. Don't want to do that
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, this is one of those things where you have to be willing to the goal with all of our frameworks is to get to a point where the core of it is so strong that you can that you're only shifting you're only moving the focus 4 or 5 degrees as opposed to 30 or 40 or 50 degrees, looking in different directions, and you're trying to just nail it down, and then the world becomes a lot more predictable. That's not to say that it's not also going to change in ways that are going to surprise you, because it will, right?
Yeah.
And when it does, that's when you look up and you go, whoa, that one's new. And but you can see them a lot easier if you have a really strong, I think if you have a really strong framework.
Yeah.
And it's one that's a little flexible, but it's still, if you know who the bad guys are, you know who the good guys are, and you understand you've mapped everybody's incentives well, and you've done it honestly from their perspective, and you've been honest about their incentives, then it's pretty easy to figure out what their next moves are going to be, and then
Yeah.
we see if they act in accordance to that or not.
Well, so one of the things, somewhat related to what we're talking about, and I actually think this is a material um, development, I guess is the
Mm-hmm.
right way to say it.
Okay.
It doesn't change my overall thesis, and it does not change my framework, but it is something that I think is important to understand, and that is, related towards, no longer just penciling things out on a spreadsheet, understanding that politics and geopolitics and national interests are going to trump, pardon the pun, the economics of a project.
Mm-hmm.
The United States, I think there is a lot of people. First of all, I know there are because I hear from them all the time on social media and when I go to conferences. Everybody's always telling me that I need to kind of wake up and realize that the United States best days are behind it, and it's just it's a slow spiral now, but it's going to pick up into a fast spiral into a heap of ashes. And what I've always tried to say is, listen, that may eventually happen. I cannot rule that out, and I have to be open to that possibility. But despite all its flaws and despite all the mistakes it's made, it still owns the best piece of real estate in the world. It still has incredible resources and assets that the rest of the world just doesn't have. It has the system that currently exists was set up to favor the United States. You could even go so far as to say it is rigged in favor of the United States. Now, that doesn't guarantee that the US will always, quote unquote, win, and it doesn't mean that things will always go well. But the point is if you're going to bet against them, just really understand what it is you're betting against and who it is you're betting against, and the challenge that you are up against. In other words, if you're going to storm the castle walls and have a revolution, at least know how high they are and how thick they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't delude yourself that it's made of paper and you can just run through them. And along these lines, I think if we go back to the point we were making about when COVID hit, and it showed in stark clarity the dependence that the United States had on China for certain needs, inputs, commodities, whatever you want to call them. And then that prompted the US to do a bigger analysis from a national security perspective, and you realize how much of our needed inputs come from China or, countries that are quote unquote adversarial to the United States. It showed in glaring detail what a problem we have. And one of the most bipartisan things in Washington, listen, Washington has probably never been more divided than it is now.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the very few things that they agree on is that the US needs to be self-sufficient, or at least much more self-sufficient than they are now.
Mm-hmm.
And Trump's big, beautiful bill is part of that. That is, for lack of a better way of saying it, the American manufacturing and industrial renaissance, where he wants to bring industry back to the United States, higher paying jobs, become more self-sufficient, produce things here, buy things here, and export things. That's all part of the big, beautiful bill. But part of the funding of that, and that big, beautiful bill is like $4 billion, $4 trillion over a 10-year period or something. Part of the funding of that big, beautiful bill went to a somewhat unknown department in the Pentagon, which is now known as the Department of War. And by the way, the fact that they changed it to the Department of War should give you a little bit of hint as to how seriously they are taking this. And I say that jokingly, but like, seriously, why do you think they changed it? Just for the hell of it? Probably not. So that's how serious they're taking this. And so there's a department in the Pentagon called the Office of Strategic Capital. Now, this was actually created under Biden. I can't remember if it was late 21 or early 22 that this was created. And it's an office that is supposed to kind of spearhead the US solution to being too dependent on other countries from a national security perspective. There's more to it than that, but in essence, that's what it is about. Now, Trump has not only embraced that, he has accelerated it and gave it additional funding through the big, beautiful bill. The person he put in charge of it is named Jeff Feinberg. I always forget his first. I don't know if it's Jeff or it's Keith, but his last name is Feinberg. And the reason that's important is this is not a typical government bureaucrat. It's not a career military leader who has never set foot in a Wall Street boardroom or has never done a business deal. Feinberg is the founder and chairman of Cerberus Group, which is one of the biggest and most successful private equity firms in history. And he has made billions and billions of dollars for not only himself, but all of his clients. And he has himself sat on many different presidential advisory boards and think tanks, and he's been involved in numerous, infrastructure projects and, defense contractors. So this is a guy who knows his way around not only Washington, but American industry and global industry, I should say. This guy hates losing money. The last thing he wants to do is just, hand a $1 billion to somebody and let it go to their, uncle or aunt or something. And I think that's important because most government run projects are run by career bureaucrats, not business people. The Office of Strategic Capital is a hybrid model, public and private. So Trump put a very successful private industry guy in to head it. So when you've seen these things about the United States buying a stake in Intel, or when they made a $150 million investment in MP Materials, which is a rare earth company in California, That is the Office of Strategic Capital coordinating that. Now, they're probably not listed in the papers, and Feinberg's probably not going to have his picture there because he's kind of notoriously private, but that's who's behind this. So again, and his job, they have the Office of Strategic Capital has identified a number of industries and specific sectors and critical minerals that they have specifically targeted for the government to help develop and innovate in those industries, because developing those industries will make the United States at least more independent than they currently are. And I can't tell you that this is going to be perfectly successful. I am sure something will go wrong along the way, but they are going to throw several $100 billion at this. The Office of Strategic Capital has Feinberg running it, and he is able to coordinate resources from the Department of Energy, the U.S. Treasury, the Small Business Administration, the Commerce Department, and the list goes on and on and on. So again, if you think the U.S. is going to just automatically fail, realize who you are up against. You are up against the Pentagon. You're up against the U.S. Treasury Department. You're against the Commerce Department, the Department of Energy. These are the biggest players in the world. And they are going to do whatever. They are viewing this as the 21st century Manhattan Project. This is solving this problem is a race. It's a race against China, and China's trying to solve this as well. They're trying to be independent of everybody else as well. And it is a race, and whoever wins the race will probably dominate the world for the next 30, 40, 50, 60 years. So I don't know for sure who's going to win this race, but what I do know is the United States isn't going to decide not to run. They are going to run, and they are going to run to win. And the other thing is the money is then going to go to these small and medium-sized businesses that are trying to develop. So if you're betting against the United States in this endeavor, you're not betting against, a career senator, in DC. You're betting against the people working in those factories and in those jobs and in those startups. Those are your average Americans that are doing that. So those are the people you're betting against. And again, I don't know for sure who's going to win, but to say that they're automatically going to lose, I think is crazy. And I think anybody that sits in my position and is looking at how to allocate capital, allocating capital in the United States to these industries that are going to have this huge tailwind behind them, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's natural resources, whether it's important technology, whether it's defense contractors, there is a wave coming of liquidity to those sectors. And I think to me, it's one of the biggest opportunities, investment opportunities I've seen in 25 years of doing this. Now, again, I don't necessarily like that the government's getting involved here, but I do like that it's not just coming from government bureaucrats. I like it that they're part. Oh, I didn't say. So Feinberg is running it, but he is going to partner with private investment managers who are going to put up their own capital. And their own capital is going to get invested in these arenas, and then the government's going to match it. So again, it's kind of a hybrid between government funding and private market funding. But when I look at this, I just think about, what's the likelihood that none of it succeeds? I think that's pretty low, right? And so when the U.S. sees something as an existential issue, and they are going to throw all of their resources behind it, even if they are slightly successful, it has the potential to provide enormous opportunity. And so from that perspective, that kind of stays with my overall thesis of I want to be invested in the U.S. versus the rest of the world. And that's going to kind of roll out. We have a way to access that. It's only available to accredited investors, but it's kind of exciting, and it's going to be interesting to see how this goes. But the point of this goes back to not everything is going to pencil out perfectly on a spreadsheet anymore, and there's going to be bigger forces at play that are going to determine whether or not something succeeds or fails. And I think this is a perfect example of that. I kind of went off on a long tangent there, but that's just something I'm seeing right now.
No, you didn't. That's a perfect way to end the podcast. As a matter of fact, Mr. Johnson, I really do appreciate that one because that was important. And I don't really think I have anything to add to other than I can see some historical precedents to it, but I've already kind of mentioned them. So, with that said, Brent, I know you got a hard stop. Let's do it. Tell people where they
Thanks
can
for
find
having me.
you and all that happy.
Yeah, so you can go to our web. If you want to contact us, we have a website, just santiagocapital.com. It's got a lot of information on there. If you go to research.santiagocapital.com, that is our research offering. We've got a couple different levels there that you can sign up. We typically write about the intersection of capital markets, geopolitics, and the madness of crowds. And then I'm pretty active on X, as you know, X or Twitter, just Santiago Capital. It's the white seashell. And I love mixing it up on there. So anyway, I appreciate you having me on. It's always fun talking to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brent. As always, I'm TFL 1728. Patreon/Gold Goats and Guns, which is how we pay the bills. So you guys be well. You take care. We'll talk soon. Keep your stick on the ice.